Hello, everybody, and welcome to the July edition of our Atlas Live webinar. Very excited to have you here wherever you're coming from, whether that's Australia, overseas, if you're dialing in at night and wanting to learn about what we do down here at Atlas in Australia. Happy to show you and very happy to introduce Bart Davidson as well with me. Hello, Bart, how are you?
Very well, Vic. I just saw myself with hair. Thank you.
Yeah, it is a little bit of a difference to how you look today. Same with me. I've chopped half of mine off, so we're both sporting shorter haircuts. We are digging deeper today in exploring what's involved in an Atlas Carbon farm visit, which is very exciting because Bart actually heads up our team who do those visits and all the analysis and comprehensive detail of recommendations that all flow out of those visits. So that's what we'll be talking about today, and I appreciate you joining me, Bart. Here's a bit of our agenda. So we will talk just briefly about the Atlas Carbon process. If you haven't heard about us, welcome. Really appreciate you being here. And if you don't know much about what we do in terms of the specific process of how we get from the first expression of interest from producers to a soil carbon project, then that's what we'll go through, and specifically focusing on that farm visit element. We'll talk about the importance of due diligence. So art versus science, the intersection of both, which is what we think really encapsulates what a farm visit involves. And then we'll explore actually what happens. So we'll talk to Bart about what he does when he goes out for the day on any given property, and then have a bit of a Q&A. So we've got a Q&A box on your Zoom screen. If you have any questions, pop them in there. We'll see if we've got time at the end. If we don't get to all of them, we'll come back to you. But yeah, anything that pops up during the webinar, don't hesitate to ask the question. So if you're here for the first time, like I said, welcome. We are both Atlas Carbon and Maya Grazing. And if you haven't heard of Atlas Carbon before, we partner with graziers to do soil carbon projects in grazing management systems. And we really focus on the how of helping people do that. So looking at what are the parts of the grazing system that can really be improved or bolstered to really do a lot of soil carbon sequestration and really make that happen. Maya Grazing is the software tool. We've been with Maya, Bart's one of our co-founders of Maya Grazing for nearly 10 years now, and that is all about grazing management, measuring what you manage. So all about capturing data within your grazing management system to match your stocking rate to carrying capacity, grow more grass, have more livestock, all of those good things. So just briefly, we'll go across this timeline of the Atlas process. So if you are a producer who's interested in a soil carbon project, you put an expression of interest in with us that just is the basics of your rainfall, location and size of your property. And then we'll go through to a property questionnaire, which touches on a few different things: current infrastructure, livestock that you've got on the property, history of how long that infrastructure has been in place, those sorts of things, so we can come up with our cost benefit report. Now, this is a free service that we provide here at Atlas to really look at a desktop view of would a soil carbon project be a viable option for you and your property, looking at the costs involved and the projected soil carbon and production uplifts. So like I mentioned before, we are all about the productivity of a grazing business, boosting that core productivity, and then carbon is just the cherry on top of that. And then the last part of that is if that cost benefit looks good, looks like a viable option for you, and you want to move to the next step, that's where the farm visit comes into play. And this is what we'll be talking about today. And that's really ground truthing a lot of those things that we have modeled out within that cost benefit report, really getting a good idea of how producers operate, giving you the opportunities for how Atlas operates and seeing if there's a synergy there to go through to a soil carbon project together. So all that being said, like I mentioned, we'll be focusing on that farm visit, and I'd like to reintroduce Bart Davidson, who is our Chief Grazing Officer of Atlas Carbon, which I think encapsulates a lot of different hats. Bart, would you say that's accurate?
Oh, I think so. It probably understates the importance of grazing and its intersection with everything else in all that we do. But yes, I think I like the title. Yeah.
Yeah, look, like I said, really appreciate you being here. I know your time is valuable, and And I know that Atlas, we talk a lot about the expertise within our team to help producers not only build that soil carbon, but retain it throughout that 25-year period of a soil carbon project. So what gives you the authority to be able to tell people how we actually, or suggest how we actually do this?
Just remembering to turn my phone off. Thanks, Vic.
That's all right.
No, it's a good question. I think, fundamentally, what I love about this role, what I love about this team, what I love about what we do, and what I love about the space, independently of Atlas or any other business here, this really is about the intersection of people, what they do, how they decide, and the decisions that they do make with respect to day to day, week to week, month to month, as it applies to the consumption of grass, as it applies to how they manage the farm, and then through to the data at the end, right? So I've been very fortunate. I've had a career blessed me with the opportunity to, well, first of all, study soil science back in the day. Be blessed to have spent quite a lot of time in due diligence in the acquisition of properties around the country, which really does put the wood on getting a good handle on what you think the place can do before exorbitant amounts of money are exchanged for the property. That was long ago, but definitely instilled in me some important disciplines around what is actually important to ultimately production, and where are the numbers that we can recognise that in, because that's half of the battle here, apart from the price tag on agricultural land these days. It's absolutely critical. So I spent years in that space, and then I was very fortunate to move from a very cropping centric and horticulture centric place, if you like, for a decade or so, into grass. I just fell in love with grass quite a while ago, and never really fell out of love with it, because it's a more predictable, less unpredictable beast than cropping, and that goes to the heart of the soil chemistry, seasonality, moisture, conversion of sun through photosynthesis into an output that we can get some maths around and do it with a bit less heartache than I found would be the case in cropping. So long and short of it, got a bit of a handle on the above.
Yeah, there's a lot of history there, and I think it really shows. And I wanted to talk about, when we talk about a farm visit and the importance of due diligence in any sort of soil carbon project. And for us, it really is, I've put art versus science, but I think it shows the intersection of both incredibly well, and your passion for both incredibly well, which is obviously the science, and you've gone through how you've done soil science, and it's built a lot from that scientific background, but your passion for the people and getting a really good handle of what makes them tick, what is their drivers, what are the things that are actually going to be the drivers within this soil carbon project, and does it align with us? And I think that's really important, that we know it's all about finding that relationship, because these are partnerships in these soil carbon projects, and we need to build that relationship. Producers need to trust us, and we need to trust them, that we all understand what needs to be done and we're all on the same page. And so this process for the farm visit is hugely about transparency between producer and us at Atlas, to make sure that we're all on the same page. And I think you bring a huge amount of credibility to that, Bart, because a lot of people really trust you, and it is, you provide this safe space during this
Okay.
process.
Enough of the nice. Thank you.
Am I embarrassing you too much?
Yeah, a little bit. But I appreciate the sentiment, and I think a couple of quick points. There is a team. We're building out a team of really proficient combinations of skill sets beyond myself to undertake what ultimately becomes a good understanding of a farm. I appreciate everything you've just said there. I think it does matter. There's an obligation, to care. There's an obligation here for us to understand a potential project. Everything is, I always love to say in the paddock that I'm agnostic until proven otherwise. I just do not go into any situation to do with the carbon project with a preconceived idea about what's right or in between, because it's risky to do so. And I'd like to come back to the word project. I often think the market is growing. The awareness and the sensitivities and the intelligence in the space is growing exponentially, market driven. But there's a key word here, you know, a carbon project, right? It is a project. It's not a snapshot of soil. It's not a snapshot of a set of numbers. It's actually a project. And that means, just like when we're at school, you've got to do stuff. But
Yeah.
you can't just punch the ticket and hope the magic pudding provides. There's actually a project involved here, which means that there are people involved, you know, people who make decisions, sometimes good, sometimes poor. In the greater scheme of things, Atlas is going into a relationship with a landholder. Very important to understand the wherewithal, the ability to execute, and that doesn't mean proficiency now. That doesn't mean capacity or particular skills now. It does mean, though, you know, a perspicacity for having a go, for learning, for taking on disciplines and practices that will ultimately, again, I'm simplifying here, but increase the cycling of biomass into carbon, however and whatever. So that's our job. Yeah, well, that's our role. It's about doing the things that we can't just do by remote in a perfect world. It is an imperfect world. We need to see where people, livestock, grass, and soil ultimately intersect. That's the reason for the reference to due diligence, because a carbon project is not a trivial thing. It's a meaningful execution.
Yeah, and I think it's also important to remember the heart of this for what we do, and our history within Maya Grazing is all about helping producers, you know, reach their maximum potential on properties, really boost carrying capacity, really focus on that core business of livestock production. And the carbon aspect is a real cherry on top of that, and you know, the government's incentive to want to encourage people to do that. So that's really what I think we focus on, is looking at that business at the base level and building up from there.
Yeah, you remind me, actually, and it's unrelated and it's tangential, but I'll say it anyway. I'm often reminded when I'm in a paddock bouncing around a ute how wonderfully increased the capacity of the agricultural world would be if we could just play a game of switcheroo where people that have had to build up their understanding of grazing, farming on challenging soils versus those on wonderfully beautiful, deep, fertile soils, and the sensitivity of people to their time and place, and then move them around a bit. That comes out all the time for me, just how normalized the farm becomes to people. And then if we could expose them to other farms and help them realize just how good they've got it or just how tough they've got it, it actually would speed up a lot of what we're just talking about there. Anyway,
Yeah, I think that's
the
good.
bottom
And
line there is it's about people and the decision making that they apply to the landscape, because it isn't just numbers to do with carbon.
for sure. And that's probably a great segue to actually start talking about, well, what is involved when you do come out in a farm visit. I mean, we've had a look at, say, the cost benefit report of the property. We've done some analysis on what it may cost and what that potential uplift is. And so what's your thinking around when you're driving around a paddock? And it is a very involved process with the producer. It's not just you coming out and saying, point me in the direction of what paddock you think, and I'll take some samples and head off. It is very consultative and a hugely involved process with the grazier and the producer. So talk us through that.
We have a bit of a leg up here. I mean, in that I've had the good fortune and we collaborate with people that have had the good fortune of doing this for a couple of decades. And so there's actually a bit of an art and science to rocking up to a farm and having a cup of tea and working through all of this stuff. And in the past, instinctively working out, okay, we should be looking at this, and instinctively we should be looking at that. And, you know, sometimes we get it right and sometimes we get it wrong. And I'm talking there about agronomists working through a farm from an advisory point of view. And taking that forward now to the real world where, well, the new age world, I should say, you know, mobile phones and all the rest of it, where there's an enormous amount of tech at our disposal. So when we turn up at the farm nowadays, half the job has been done in prep in terms of understanding a lot of the intersecting layers of, we call it metadata, but the landscape, right? Every farm is a landscape. Now, whether we arrive with that, some sort of prep or otherwise, our role is to turn up and try and understand what that landscape has, the story that it has to tell. Now, sometimes it's easy, sometimes it's hard, but that's the job of any, I think, agronomist / agricultural advisor, full stop. But certainly when it comes to a carbon project, our task is to unwrap that, is to understand it, with the most amount of value for the least amount of time, because literally we're talking about a day or two, but it's a full chunk of time by the time we do our day's prep, our day on the farm, and then all the subsequent work. There's a bunch of time there, but we do that to essentially capture an essence, right? And I'll just explain the essence again for us when we're undertaking this. It's a pretty clear objective, and that is from a property perspective, where is this place now? Right? Because we're talking about going into a potential carbon project. So where is it now? Because that really matters. You know, is it at the bottom of the ebb or is it at the top of the tide? From both a management perspective, capital perspective, wherewithal perspective, but certainly carbon perspective. And then number two, what's the potential for transfer upside? And by transfer, I mean, you know, increasing carbon through the intersection of management, livestock, grass, and soil, and all the other bits, to increase that first number, which is the current level, which isn't just one number, it's a whole bunch of numbers. And then lastly, the retention. You know, what is the maths around the retention of that between here and another couple of decades, and how does that all flow together? And so that's the essence of that at a property level versus a paddock level or a landscape level. Is we essentially have to break the farm up into what I call it a bunch of rooms, right? Our job is to do the maths sufficiently before we get to the farm that we know when we get there with some flexibility that we're going to look for all of the variation that we can find in that property, that landscape, to unearth the good, the bad, and the ugly in terms of how it hangs together from a soil chemistry point of view, a grass point of view, and a people point of view.
Yeah. And I think going through to this slide here where you're talking about it, I think that process, you're being very open as you're discovering those things when you're going through and actually sharing all of those insights with the producer on the farm at the time. Is there anything particularly that people ask you about during those farm visits, or is it really just depends?
I love it. And I love it because people are involved and it's not a cookie cutter exercise. No two farms are the same. No two farms are the same at any at different points in time. It's a lovely, lovely thing to behold. That's why I just love this space, because there is nothing like a farm trying to tell its story. And by that I mean, okay, so back to your earlier question. We're always very conscious of being there to add value, not to make judgments. We're there to learn. We're there to help others ultimately get a better understanding of their property, but also for us to get a better understanding of that property and its capacity to increase carbon. And ultimately how that looks, you know, I find it fascinating because I'm a bit abstract in my thinking sometimes and get into trouble for it. But ultimately, I do look at the farm through the prism of the people that we're with. I'm looking at it through their eyes. And then I step back and I look at it through my eyes or the eyes of people that have seen other parts of the world to this farm, because everything becomes very normalized. If you come into my kitchen and tell me how to cook, I'm gonna be pretty sensitive to how you talk about that and really think about what matters in that, and then be conscious of where there are things that can be seen or observed and some opinions around that I haven't come across before, because I just haven't been exposed to it, because I've been stuck on this farm for quite a while and I haven't been across a bunch of others. So that's a large part of it, right? And pull me up when I ramble a bit here, but ultimately, I think a big part of this, if I just step back, it's about finding language. One of the difficult things on a farm is finding language that allows you to communicate whether things are good, bad, or ugly. And numbers often do that. One of the beautiful things about a bunch of the data that we generate is that we put a thread through the farm in terms of numbers, not just carbon, but soil chemistry, grazing numbers as well. And that helps. But we come across people that are everything from corporate execs resuming the farm to farmhands and everything in between, and all levels of educational experience in between and exposure to variation in between, which means that there's no right or wrong. And so we have to go back to how that communicates. And so just to give you a very brief idea of what that means, we'll go across the spread of country on a farm, whether it's 1,000 hectares or 20,000 hectares, and ultimately build a picture as we go of how this slice of soil chemistry and this slice of this landscape behaves, and find language for that. You know, what's the yield? What's the recovery in the grazing period? What did the last graze here look like? How does that look over the last 12 months. And in short, no, I haven't got forever to talk here. In short, I find it such a simple thing that is all too rare for people that have been on the farm for their duration, is to look down versus looking across. And we often look across the landscape and get a feel for it, instinctively. We are always in the busyness of doing and the activity of doing, and it's really quite valuable to look down and to actually stop in your own property and look down. And by that I mean, look into the grass, look into the soil, look at the topsoil versus the subsoil, look at where the roots are stopping because of things that we decided or didn't decide years ago, or even the last graze. And I love to say, where we are right now is the sum total of every graze that we've done, and particularly in the grazing properties, obviously. But every graze is a decision. Every graze is another slice in the chapter of the book of this farm. And little small incremental changes make meaningful gains. And so when people actually see the result of their last 10 years of making this decision versus that decision in terms of how they move stock around or cultivate or add stuff to it or reseed it or whatever, when you actually pull up and look down and you look into it, and I don't mean just the soil, I mean how many bites on the plant.
Yeah.
That can often be quite a revelation for folks. And then you tag to that some language that we can have a common understanding about, like yield, graze yield, recovery periods, density, etc. Then all of a sudden you've got a lingo and a language that allows you to compare and contrast where we just were with where we are right now versus where we're about to go. And it's not about my farm versus your farm. It's actually about within this farm, what's making the money, what's making the production versus what's actually dragging the chain a bit and hurting us, and that we might be able to do something about that we haven't been conscious of for various reasons. And flushing that out through the grazing does actually help quite enormously, because you're not focused on another language of soil chemistry.
Yeah, and I think that's a great way for us to start talking about this is looking down into those soils. And I know you said it's not just soil, but that's a great place to start. And I think it's a really important place to start, because it is the basis of what makes cation exchange capacity within soils is really the driver for carbon, and a lot of other elements of that chemistry as well is a big part of that, the carbon projects and what makes a successful project or not. And so do you want to talk about this? I know you were very keen to have this into the presentation, and I think it shows, a really, really interesting side of you, Bart, with your bucket hat, but also with the soil and the root systems holding it together and what that means.
I love that hat. I love that part of Central Queensland. Look, I love that particular photo, and I wish it was the cocky involved that was holding that coil core, not myself. But it really, I just love that photo because not only is the sunset casting a shadow through the core onto me there, but it was actually triple that length, and then unfortunately it broke before someone got a photo. But we had literally a 60 centimeter core. It was pulled together and held together, not by clay, but guess what? By the previous, 700 days of decision making by the people that were moving animals around on there and seeing these deep rooted perennial plants doing their thing versus where we were just previously, and it wasn't happening. And we could connect that and link that to the management process. And how do you build carbon? Well, there's all sorts of stuff that people will confuse you with there, but ultimately you punch more roots more deeply for longer periods of time with perenniality and consistency. Well, you're going to build soil carbon. So then there's all this other stuff to do with cation exchange and temperatures that you pointed out there, and that's a big part of what we are aiming to achieve through the farm visit, i.e. placement of that in context of this paddock versus that paddock, and areas and the maths of how that looks in carbon production. But I also love that other core there, just because often, and it blows me away, I'm a soils guy, but it blows me away how often people who've been on a farm, whether it's a year or literally the fifth generation, it'll be the first time they've looked closely at what an impact the plants are having on the soil. If you think about how you're going to change soil at 15, 20, 25 centimeters, 30 centimeters, there is nothing you can do to change that soil except through the plant, right?
Yeah.
There's no other way, right? So when we look at it and we see it, we look at this bit and look at that bit and we look at the structure, we talk about bulk density and we talk about the type of root activity going on, and the type of species, the diversity of plant species in the biology. That rocks my boat. You know, at the end of the day, that it used to just be fun because it was actually a very good proxy for production, and that's obviously important. But now that there's actually a market that's prepared to and willing to reward management that achieves that, i.e. the carbon market, yeah, I think it's pretty cool.
Yeah, and on from that, I mean, we do a lot of this analysis, and I know we talk, we've talked particularly a lot about the people side of things, and I think it's really important to know how deep that analysis goes and how comprehensive that is as well, to really get that good idea of what's going to be successful or not.
I think we overcooked the goose, and that's because this is due diligence and not throwing a dart at the wall. And by overcook the goose, we do the full agronomics on not just topsoil but subsoil. We get a handle on bulk density. We get a handle on the maths of carbon stocks. We get a handle on essentially the headwinds or tailwinds to growing more grass, right? Not just the outcome of that. The outcome of that is carbon. The outcome of that is stocking rate per 100 mils. But we want to know, and most producers are pretty happy to know as well, the constraints and headwinds, the constraints and tailwinds to production. And by that I mean grass production. So we did the full suite of chemistry, and that's why I say we overcooked the goose a bit, but it actually helps us enormously in terms of understanding the key linkages for carbon production ultimately. So,
which really brings that transparency element down, back to making sure that everyone understands the real lay of the land and how things are currently, and not really selling people, down the garden path to say that every farm is going to be a great success in a carbon project, because that's, fundamentally it's so much more nuanced than that. And I think being able to provide that full suite of analysis is a huge part of that as well, to really understand the chemistry and structure and biology of everything that's going on, to provide those answers and our recommendation of what would be more successful or not. Anything particular you wanted to talk to regarding these very detailed?
Sure. Look, I'm conscious of time, but I could talk about this all day. I'd rather do this than work, to be honest. This is work. Well, I'm conscious there that, you triggered thoughts for me. Ultimately, we tend to think of this farm versus that farm, and this farm's as good and that one's not, and this and that. But every farm has good and bad. Every farm has an ugly duckling. Every farm has a princess child, right? Every farm has this variation, and sometimes the variation is great, sometimes the variation is small. And the task is to flush that out, because ultimately that impacts the mass of the whole thing. And what always blows me away is that people tend to forget the ugly child and ignore it, and over foster the lovely tree. I'm talking here about soils and pastures, right? And flushing it out and actually putting it on the table and having a conversation about these things actually is really quite a revelation and beneficial, because otherwise normal just continues forever. And these photos just trigger me to think about that. Why is that pasture crop there of oats struggling the way it was, and all of this other, there's just no end of questions and ifs and buts and wherefores that when we actually just stop, do some analysis, talk through a bit of the past about this and that, it actually comes out in the wash. So I love that, because there's a lot of wasted energy in farms. There's a huge amount of wasted energy that goes to all the ifs and buts in the absence of some pretty clinical on-farm, okay, this is what the maths tells us.
Yeah. And again, we are, a little short on time. I don't like cutting you off, Bart, because I feel like all of this is so important. And this is just a snippet of what anyone can expect when you come out on the farm. And it's great to be able to go through this in detail as well. But I know that you're working on trying to get more results in the paddock as well. I mean, obviously we've got a huge suite of lab results for soil testing and tissue testing for your pastures, that sort of thing. But these speak to a couple of things that you can do right then and there in the paddock with the producer.
Sure. It's a world of tech now compared to where we were, isn't it? And there's a lot of geolocation, a lot of specificity around the landscape, and that's on the left there. We've got some stratification, some landscape data and layers that we look to and look at when we're on the farm, and essentially our ground truthing as we go through the day. And then we've got a lovely relationship with Hone, and a fantastic opportunity to see some really meaningful gains made in real-time spectroscopy in terms of measuring carbon in field, which is really a game changer in terms of cost and time compared to the old world of labs, which we still rely on and still use. But I think having that flexibility and that growth in both is just absolutely fantastic. And yeah, we're punching hard for it.
Yeah, no, great. And I think the last thing that I know is really important to you is the not only obviously the results that come out of what the farm visit is, but some of those more interesting stories when there are a few breakthroughs. And what are your highlights from some of the time that you've been doing this? Is there anything that really stands out that you'd like to share?
Sure. Look, in a nutshell, a couple of quick thoughts on that. What will always rock the house down is working out how a farm works and helping people understand how their farm works. That's ultimately the deal here, because that's where there is enormous value, and the challenge is to achieve that. And so it becomes, to me, or to us, the task here is to understand the context of this farm, this landscape, and then unravel it and get to a position, get to an outcome. And that's enormously satisfying for all involved. Now, sometimes it's easy and sometimes it's hard, but that's a real highlight. Now, going into another real highlight would be realizing that we're sitting on a unicorn in terms of a beautiful, deep verticile shrink swell clay that's been bashed and battered for the last 3 decades. From a carbon point of view, that to me, it just doesn't get any better than that. And you can almost sense the opportunity in those instances versus so many others where there's all these other extraneous factors. I can remember presenting folks with a metre-long verticile clay that was too good to put in the truck, that had to go on the mantelpiece. They'd never seen their own soil that deep, based in Inverell.
Yeah.
So it's that linkage of things that are otherwise a bit unseen, and really ultimately it's seeing the thread that results in output that works. And we see properties at different levels of where status, their current trajectory versus their past trajectory in terms of improving how they do what they do, and that's an incredibly rewarding thing to be involved with, because it is so different from farm to farm. And so that's an absolute highlight if you can add to that process and speed it up a little bit, or a lot sometimes. That's really what makes it work.
I think it's a testament to you, and you're fostering a team as well, and the team within what you're doing in terms of going out and doing these farm visits and doing all the ongoing work for the soil tests, pasture tests, analysis, recommendations, all of that. The team that you're fostering within that, I think, are really good at creating. I know I've said this at the start, and you got a bit embarrassed, but creating that safe space for people to be able to ask those questions that potentially, I think you said to me previously, when you go and do a field day and there's a bunch of producers there, people are sometimes nervous to ask the questions that they think may not be, might not be the right question, or people might judge them. And I think that can really hold back learning about the different parts of the property, or things that people don't know that they don't know. And I think being able to provide that, and I think that's a testament also to the long period of time that you spend with them. So it is a full day on farm, a minimum of one. And I think being able to build that trust over time, and for people to then ask the questions which they think, maybe I haven't asked before, because it might have been seen as a bit of a, not the greatest question, or bit of judgment there. Yeah.
That is definitely, one of the things. I've said it before. I do it for free a lot of the time, because it's just so wonderful for people to see people get a connection to what they know instinctively and have long held as an understanding instinctively around their farm. Right, it's their office, it's their home, it's their bedroom, it's their kitchen cupboard. It's the farm, right? It's so important to them, but yet they haven't had a language necessarily or a technical understanding of why this bit does what it does, or how this bit works in relation to that bit, that is really quite a magical thing to be part of. So that's the obligation on us as well, though. So I think it's a two-way street. You're right. I mean, we're relying on people to jump in boots and all, and it's fascinating to see how that varies from farm to farm, and people's intent and enthusiasm for what can be quite a daunting prospect, right? I mean, you're talking about someone coming into your kitchen and seeing if you've cleaned the cupboards. It's and how you do what you do.
Mm-hmm.
Without fail, though, it's a positive experience for both sides. Yeah.
That's great. I really appreciate all that, Bart. We're actually not as much over time as I first suspected we would be, and we have 0 questions. So clearly we've answered everything perfectly. But if there are anyone on the call who does have questions, feel free to get in touch with us, and we'll get either myself or Bart to get back to you. So this makes this slide very redundant. So I'll jump through. If you are interested in going through the process and starting with that free cost benefit report, it is a very short sort of 5 to 10 minute questionnaire that you can fill out, and we will come back to you with a 6-page report based on all the things Bart talking about at an estimation modelling level. So he'll go through your data and actually be able to customize this report, and we can then present it back to you, and the farm visit then comes after that process if that all is positive. But otherwise, any last thoughts, Bart? I know you are sporting a shorter haircut. Was there any particular reason behind that?
Oh, no, thanks, Vic. No, that's really just in solidarity for those that are fighting cancer at the moment, and with a
It's a
pretty
very
close relationship.
very good cause, and I know you're very passionate about that cause, so I was glad that we could bring that up and bring it to light. So appreciate all your time today, everything that you've given in this presentation. It's so hugely valuable, and I really hope that yeah, we can carry on with improving as we go, and really getting more and more data around the different types of farms, because I know that's your passion, is to see things that you haven't seen before and really start learning the nuances with every farm that you go through. So if you are interested in this cost benefit report, don't hesitate to get in touch. And I really thanks again, Bart. I really appreciate everyone on the call for jumping in. This will be recorded and sent to you automatically. So if you're here, you'll get a copy of it if there's any words of wisdom that you wanted to revisit. But otherwise, that's all from me, all from you, Bart.
And thank you, Victoria, for the clarity in your questions and thinking, and thank you very much.
No problem. Thanks a lot. See you later.